Welcome, everyone, to the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy, and we are now on the final lecture, Lecture 23, Alfred Marshall. Some of you may be feeling a sense of accomplishment, others perhaps a sense of relief. So, Marshall was from 1842 to 1924. Some biographical remarks. Born in London, studied mathematics at St. John's College in Cambridge, and incidentally, Marshall, by all accounts that I've read, was a much better mathematician than even the explicitly mathematical economists of that period, such as Jevons and Walras. Right? So we think of Jevons and Walras as the ones who were big advocates of math and economics, whereas Marshall was not. I mean, he's got some famous passages where he, in a letter to a friend, I believe it was explaining his philosophy about the use of math. And he says, like, if you can't translate it into English and use examples that a layperson would understand, then, you know, it's not worth going down that route. And what he did in his principles book was relegate the math to footnotes or even appendices. All right, so he tried to keep the main text readable for the layperson, and that's part of the explanation for his success, that he quite consciously wanted his book to be something that the gentleman of the day could read and profit from. And so that, again, that's part of it. It's not just purely a marketing element. It's that he really did think that there was economic logic and that math might help you steer yourself straight and reach certain conclusions, perhaps guide yourself through the argument, but that if all you could do was point to a bunch of equations, then you really didn't understand it economically. Okay, he was a professor of political economy at the University College in Bristol, and then eventually he ended up as professor of political economy at Cambridge, where he was succeeded by his star pupil, A.C. Pigou, that you guys might have heard of, a Pigovian tax, for example, on a negative externality. So Pigou was the person who invented that concept or that strategy, and he was a famous student of Alfred Marshall. Also, they can talk about the Cambridge School that Alfred Marshall founded. I mean, so Cambridge, of course, existed before Alfred Marshall started teaching there, but you get the point in terms of economic schools of thought. Okay, so some of his works. So the big one, both in terms of pages and influence or impact, was his Principles of Economics, which came out in 1890. And just so you know how big it was, I believe the first edition was in the 700s of pages, and then the revised ones later broke. It was more than 800 pages. So this was the dominant economics textbook for decades. So again, it came out in 1890, and then depending on how you time it, it was the dominant book, the thing that everybody, certainly English speakers, used as to sort of get up to speed on what's the state of the art of economic knowledge at this point, at least through the, let's say, 1920s, 1930s perhaps. So that's what a lot of people used, and that was summarizing the state of economic science at that time. Some of his other works, which weren't nearly as important, not because they were bad, but just because his Principles of Economics was so huge. The Pure Theory of Foreign Trade, which came out in 1879, and then later in his career, he had Money, Credit, and Commerce in 1923. So I picked those in terms of just relaying them to you guys just to show he did write on sort of particular subjects. It wasn't that he always was just writing grand treatises to try to cover everything. So let me spend a minute talking about this phrase you might hear called the neoclassical synthesis. So this began with Alfred Marshall. All right, so if you had to say who founded the neoclassical school, or who is the first major figure in what we might call the neoclassical tradition, I think most people would say it's got to be Alfred Marshall. And so you may, again, I'm assuming a lot of people who are taking Liberty Classroom courses listen to lectures by modern-day Austrian economists. And so a lot of times when the Austrians are trying to contrast their approach with what the other guys are doing, they will often say, they might use the phrase mainstream, but they might also say the neoclassicals. All right, and so this is sort of the default position now, that if you say, hey, you're going to go to an Ivy League school in the United States and learn, get a PhD in economics, what is it that you're learning? Well, I mean, if you go to Chicago, you could say, okay, we're learning Chicago school stuff, fair enough. But some places, they might explicitly consider themselves to be a Keynesian program. But the standard, I think people would say it's neoclassical. And so this goes back to Alfred Marshall. So what does this term mean? Well, literally, it's saying like the new classicals. But the reason for this phrase is that Marshall actually did not think there ever was a marginal revolution. So remember how the structure of this course, for example, and this isn't my idiosyncrasy, this is standard stuff in the history of economic thought, they will say, okay, you had David Hume and Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, and they were the British classical economists. And then you had the marginal revolution in the early 1870s with Jevons and Menger and Walras. And that overturned the classical approach to value and price and gave us the modern marginal utility explanation. Right? So what I just said to you, I'm recapitulating things we've been hammering from numerous angles during this course, but I want to reassure you that, again, is not something unique to me. It's not even something that the Austrians talk about, but other historians of economic thought don't. No, that's standard stuff. You grab any history of economic thought book, and they're going to have that narrative in it, or at least acknowledge that that's the accepted narrative. So it's ironic then that Alfred Marshall, who was such a giant in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he rejected that narrative. He said, no, actually, this so-called modern new value theory, you can see hints of that in people well before the 1870s. Even in classical economists, like the British classical economists, but more particularly, he liked, for example, the German von Thunen, and who it's quite true to say that he wrote on, for example, marginal productivity theory for sure, and some other mathematical treatments of economic problems, things like what's now called location theory or spatial economics. So imagining like some group of people that are like out in the middle of nowhere, unconnected from anything else, and then studying patterns and, well, how would the town settle and how far away would they be from the location of prime natural resource deposits and things like that, and what would the price structure have to be to make it worthwhile for people to carry the goods further and further out from the city center, things like that, which was very advanced for his time, and it was sort of unknown, and people look to the marginal revolutionaries in the 1870s as the ones who brought all this stuff to the attention of the profession. And so Marshall was saying that it's not right. We shouldn't be saying that. It's not true that Jevons and Menger and Walras were the ones who discovered all this stuff, right? So it's not worth us getting into the weeds and trying to referee this dispute. For sure, von Thunen, he did publish stuff that was arguably half a century ahead of its time in some cases, and nowadays more people will recognize his role, even though he was not appreciated at the time. I mean, I guess you could say it was Alfred Marshall who sort of brought him to everybody's attention. But in any event, what Marshall was trying to do was he thought he was just going to fairly summarize the state of economic knowledge in his principles book, and he was going to draw on all of the different trains of thought and all the different traditions. And so again, just to reiterate what I said, he rejected this idea that there was this marginal revolution. He thought, no, it's a gradual accumulation over time of certain nuances and techniques, but it's not like there was this sharp breaking point, which before then was the Dark Ages and nobody knew about marginal utility. And then afterwards, now we know all this great stuff because of these three geniuses. He rejected that. And he also said he, in particular, did not learn about what we nowadays call marginal utility and marginal productivity from Menger, Jevons, and Ross. He said that he got that stuff from earlier economists, or he invented it himself. Incidentally, that was also another characteristic of Marshall, is he was very humble. So in his own book, he actually refined certain doctrines or techniques, but he didn't say, oh, and so let me improve upon what these guys. He made it look like he was just summarizing what everybody already knew, when in fact he improved the exposition at the very least, and in some cases just made up new stuff that some of it economists thought was good and they can embrace, and other stuff we don't use anymore. But again, the point I'm making here is that Marshall was very humble, at least in print in his book, and so it wasn't clear a lot of the stuff that was actually his own innovation. So probably those things put together explain some of the reasons for the success of the book, right? That he didn't come off like he was bashing everybody else and was just making it look like, hey, this is standard stuff, but he was improving it. And again, the point about relegating the mathematics to footnotes or appendices to keep the main text in English, literally. Okay, so let me discuss some of the genuine contributions that Marshall made, where it wasn't simply that he was taking what earlier economists had done and just sort of cleaning it up a little bit, the stuff that you really want to point to and say it was because of Marshall that economists nowadays have this technique or this doctrine, if you will. Okay, so one of the most obvious ones is what we might call partial equilibrium analysis. So you contrast this with, remember, the Walrasian approach of general equilibrium analysis. So here, if you've taken any economics courses, this is what they do. They do partial equilibrium analysis, where you're looking at one specific market and you might say, okay, there's some shock to the system. Now let's trace the effects through. Unless you're in a PhD program or, let's say, a master's program and you're well into it, you're probably doing a partial equilibrium analysis with that. You're probably not having a model of the entire economy, introducing some exogenous change in one of the variables, and then recalculating the grand new equilibrium to see what was the total change in every element of the system. You're probably not doing that. Instead, what you're probably doing is focusing on one or maybe two markets that you think are going to be particularly affected by this change you have in mind, and then tracing through the effects in those markets, holding everything else constant and saying, yeah, we're not going to worry about the possible feedback effects and reverberations throughout the economy, because then we'll be here all day. Let's just look at this one particular market or two. So that's what partial equilibrium analysis is. Incidentally, I was reading Lionel Robbins in his lecture in his History of Economic Thought class on Marshall, and he went out of his way to say that he thought it was crazy how the disciples of Walras used to make fun of Marshall and say, oh, these Marshallians, they don't understand the importance of general equilibrium analysis. You know, and so they're just doing an incomplete job. We have the full explanation over here in our models following the master Walras. And so Robbins was saying that's crazy, that if you read, and he was giving specific citations, we don't need to get into the weeds to that level, but he was saying if you read Marshall, here, here, and here, and he was giving the page numbers, it's clear that Marshall was aware of the possibility of doing it this way and just thought, nah, for the purposes of isolating the particular factors we have in mind here and the things we want to focus on, it's actually clarifying to hold everything else constant and not try to deal with the whole system. Instead, let's just look at the impact this has in this one little area of the economy, and that's going to enlighten us more than doing it the other way. So, and also, as we said, because Marshall apparently was a much better mathematician than Walras, so it's not like Marshall was incapable of doing what Walras did. It's just he thought, actually, that's going to obscure the economic intuition that I'm trying to convey to my reader. Okay. I think most people would agree one of the major contributions that Marshall gave to economics was having distinct periods of analysis. So in terms of the duration of time, when you want to isolate the effect of some factor. So the terminology he might use would be like the market period, the short period, and the long period. Nowadays, we might generally have the same concepts, but we might use different labels. Like you might say in the immediate run, the short run, and the long run, something like that. Or you might talk about the intermediate run. So let me just walk through a simple example. I'm not saying this is exactly how Marshall would have dealt with this type of topic, but I just want you at least to understand this notion of having different periods of analysis. So imagine we're talking about the market for cigarettes. And right now, we can talk about a carton of cigarettes, and let's just say it has a market price of $100. Just picking a nice round number. It's got many packs of individual packs in there in the whole carton, and right now it sells for $100. And then all of a sudden, the consumer preferences change. There's a campaign, a bunch of celebrities come out and say, hey, kids, smoking's not cool, gives you lung cancer, you want to be around for your kids and grandkids, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So all of a sudden, there's this huge drop in the demand for cigarettes. So in the immediate run, or the market period, where you already have cartons of cigarettes right now, at this moment, how many cartons of cigarettes exist, that's a fixed number. They exist right now. And a change in subjective preferences doesn't immediately cause there to be a different amount of cartons of cigarettes that exist. So instantly, or virtually instantly, market prices are going to adjust because of this drop in demand. So the people at the convenience stores or whatever who are selling cigarettes, all of a sudden demand falls through the floor, and they can't move the cigarettes off their shelves the way they had expected, the way they had been doing it before. And so instead of those cartons costing $100, maybe they drop down to $50 a carton, right? So there's this huge plummet in order for the people to move the cartons of cigarettes off their shelves, clear out their inventory. And then now, though, you can adjust a little bit, and you say, okay, going forward now, on the production side, there's some adaptation, right? So that the factories, the plants that are cranking out cartons of cigarettes, maybe they slow down their operations. So before, if they were running 3 shifts a day with workers, maybe they scale it back to only 2 shifts a day, things like that, all right? And so that could be one of the responses. But there's still this pipeline of farmers had planted tobacco, and so depending on where we were in the cycle, the agricultural cycle, when this massive change in preferences hits the system, maybe you got to wait longer to start taking land out of cultivation that previously was used for tobacco and start planting something else. So maybe there's a period where, that tobacco is still going to come online and hit the market because it was already, it's too late by the time that, they had already planted and it was already set in motion. And also, the factories have very specialized equipment that is really only good for making cartons of cigarettes. Right? It's not that you can instantly change it over and all of a sudden those same machines make Bibles or something. These kind of machines. So it takes time. So what's going to happen now that the demand for the final product for cigarettes is lower? You might see people not replacing those machines as they wear out. So maybe in that intermediate run, or that what we might call the short run, when you still have the existing tobacco that's coming online and you're still using the machines that really are only good for making cartons of cigarettes, maybe the price recovers a little bit, right? Because they shift how many, or they reduce how many shifts of workers they have in each run now. Instead of making it at full capacity, maybe they scale it back a little bit. And so that reduces the supply somewhat that's now hitting the shelves that the retailers are getting, month after month. And so maybe now the price, instead of being $50, remember, because originally to clear what was sitting on the shelves before people knew that there was going to be this change in preferences, the price dropped way down to $50. So now maybe the price recovers to $75 as the amount of cartons hitting the shelves is lower than it was before, the moment when the shock hit. But still, we're not in long-run equilibrium. the system still needs to adjust to the fact that the demand for cigarettes is much lower than it was originally. But again, this takes an even longer time of adjustment because, as we say, there have been long-term fixed investments made, like in plant equipment and things like that. Or even to the extent, if you really want to do a long-term analysis, that certain agronomists went into studying tobacco. There's certain people whose expertise is in the production and distribution of cigarettes, certain marketing executives or whatever. And so you could see how 50 years later, there's not going to be as many people devoted to the cigarette industry or the tobacco industry as there was originally. But that sort of thing takes a real long time to flip over. And so when all is said and done, the final price of a carton of cigarettes is going to be higher than even 75. Again, assuming that new demand holds constant, and we're not worrying about the purchasing power of money and things like that in this kind of simple analysis. And you could say, well, is it going to be higher or lower than $100? We actually don't know. It depends on whether it's what's called an increasing or a decreasing cost industry. So certainly the quantity that's going to be the quantity of cartons of cigarettes hitting the market month after month, once they let the machinery wear out and they don't replace it, and so the number of factories in the country that are devoted to cranking out cartons of cigarettes, that's going to go down. But it's not obvious. You wouldn't know a priori whether, when everything settles down, is that final price going to be higher or lower. It depends. Okay, another innovation that Marshall gave us was in the drawing of supply and demand curves. All right, so the way that you draw supply and demand curves today, that was popularized by Marshall. All right, so there had been different ways of, so the economists certainly had the notions, the concepts of supply and demand under their belts well before Marshall came along, but the point of how to depict a diagram in terms of a diagram or graphically, that's what Marshall gave us. And incidentally, in case you've ever wondered, why is it that, doesn't it seem weird? Doesn't it seem like we put price on the wrong axis when it comes to supply and demand? Normally with an XY plane, you've got the independent variable on the x-axis and the dependent variable on the y-axis, and yet in economics, normally, nowadays when we think about it, we think, okay, what happens to the price? And you adjust the price on the y-axis, and then you read across from left to right to figure out, okay, so now what's the quantity either supplied or demanded at that price? And so it looks like, you might be just so used to it, you don't even think about it, but technically that seems weird. It seems like you're not using XY graphing the way we do in any other scientific application or statistical application. But I believe what happened was Marshall, when he was first developing those, the way he thought about it was that quantity was the independent variable, and then price had to adjust to clear the market. So when he was first drawing those curves and developing it, he was thinking that, okay, I'm going to put the independent variable on the x-axis, and from him, that was quantity. Right? So that's so the diagrams, once you have upward sloping supply curves and downward sloping demand curves, you're not going to switch, even if you, in terms of the causal mechanism, flip it and then start thinking of it as, oh, you tell me the price first, and then I'll tell you what the quantities supplied and demanded are, instead of saying it the other way around, that, oh, well, if this much of the product is at the market, what does the price have to be? Because if you think about it, that's, in the terms of the story I just told, it would have to be like that, right? Right now, boom, how many cartons of cigarettes exist physically? And then you could say, what does the price have to be in order to clear the market now, given the demand curve? So it's not saying, oh, for various possible hypothetical prices, what are the quantities supplied, even though that's now how we kind of define supply and demand for students at the undergrad level. Okay, Marshall also gave us versions of what we nowadays call consumer and producer surplus. The way he motivated them or explained them is not exactly how we do it today, but he certainly gave us this concept. So the idea here is, let me just talk about consumer surplus, that's easier. If you can picture a demand curve, the idea is that for the earlier units, that the height of that demand curve shows the price that somebody would be willing to pay to get those earlier units. And then as the quantity goes up, the price would have to be lower and lower in order to continually clear the market. Right? So what that's showing is, on the margin, the price would have to be lower and lower in order to get people to want to buy more and more units of whatever this good is or service. And so that's, but back then you would have explained that by saying it's diminishing marginal utility. And so if you are buying 100 units of something and the price has to be pushed down to $1 in order to get you to be willing to buy 100 units, the idea is on those earlier units, you actually value those much more than $1. Right? If you only were able to buy 4 units, maybe you would have paid $20. And so the idea is, clearly for those first 4 units, then you value them, each of those, more than $20. So if now you're going to buy 100 at $1, you're still getting the benefits from those earlier units that, by assumption, were more than 20, but yet you're only having to pay $1. Right? So you're not having to pay your full willingness to pay for each unit. You're just paying that same unit price for all the units, the one that's getting pushed down to the marginal utility. So that gap is what the consumer surplus is. Another way of motivating it is to say, you as a consumer, you benefit from the existence of markets much more than what you're gaining off that last unit. All right, so there's a sense in which if you had infinitesimally small units, you could say, yeah, someone's selling something and I'm going to keep buying more units up until the point where at the margin I am almost indifferent. Or if you're using calculus, you're exactly indifferent on that epsilon last unit. I keep buying more and more until the point at which, I don't want to buy even one more tiny little speck of that good. And so you could say, what if they didn't let you buy that very last unit? No big deal. But if they didn't let you buy all the previous units, you'd be in trouble. Right? So water has a low price. You as a consumer buy all kinds of water. You're paying for your monthly utility bills. You're taking showers. You're flushing toilets. You don't really care. You're filling your pool up, whatever, washing your car. And so if all of a sudden they were looking at your typical usage month after month, and they said, you know what, we're going to force you to consume 1 fewer gallon of water each month, you probably wouldn't care that much. But if they said, you know what, we're going to take away water from you altogether, and they looked at your bill, and typically you paid $60 a month for your water bill, and then someone said, oh, so now you're kind of out $60, right, of happiness. So, even though that's kind of a weird phrase, right? It's like you just woke up one day, and now every month they're taking $60 away from you for no reason. Is that quantifying the loss to you because now you don't have water? And you wouldn't be able to say anything because you'd be dead. So I'm just giving you an exaggerated example there to motivate this idea of consumer surplus, that the benefit you get in terms of your psychic happiness or what have you is much more than just looking at the dollars you spend on certain goods, because of this idea that on the earlier units, you're able to buy them for a much lower price than you would be willing to pay for them if you were just talking about those units. So that's what consumer surplus is. And there's something analogous on the producer side where a producer would be willing to sell, if supply curves are upward sloping, then in order to draw forth more and more units of something, the price has to be higher. And so the idea is, for those earlier units, there would be some perhaps low-cost, very efficient producers who would be willing to come in the market and sell some units at a relatively low price. But in the market clearing price, the price is way up there, and so you're drawing forth all these different suppliers to enter the market. So the ones that would have been willing to enter at a much lower price, now they're earning producer surplus on those units. So they would have been willing to sell the first through the 10th units at only $20, but the market price is now $1,000. So they're making that huge difference in producer surplus on those earlier units. So again, if you took the market away, those producers would be very upset. You wouldn't say, oh, well, didn't you produce to the point at which you were just barely breaking even on that last unit and you weren't earning any profits? So what do you care if they take the market away? Doesn't everything balance out in equilibrium? Your profits get competed? No, producer surplus shows the fallacy in that way of thinking. Just like with consumers, it would be a fallacy to say consumers keep buying units of a good up until the point at which they're indifferent, therefore they don't really benefit from the existence of this market. That would be a fallacy. By the same token with producers, if you say producers produce up until the point at which it would be unprofitable for them to bring one more unit to market, therefore they're indifferent whether this market exists or not, again, that's a fallacy. Okay, he also had this idea of increasing versus decreasing cost industries. I talked about that in my perhaps long-winded example of the tobacco market. So here the idea is, as the total quantity delivered to the market increases, it's not clear. It depends whether the total costs of production on average go up or go down. And you can think of different examples, and it might even be different depending on which range of output you have. All right, so let me just motivate this. If you are thinking about, I don't know, something like sneakers, in the beginning, if there's just one person on planet Earth who wants sneakers, they're probably going to be pretty expensive, right? Like if you're just going to have to get somebody to do them by, design them by hand or something, or use some tools that are applicable to other types of enterprises. If there's only one person who wants sneakers, it's a very niche product, and the price per pair is going to be high. Whereas you start getting thousands and thousands of people who want sneakers in standardized sizes and designs, now they can bring in techniques of mass production and so on. But it's conceivable that if everybody on planet Earth wanted 100 pairs of sneakers every month, there might be certain resource constraints kicking in, things that were in short supply that were a bottleneck to that. And so maybe the unit price would end up shooting way up depending on, again, if you run a ridiculous quantity of sneakers per person or something. So that's the logic of increasing versus decreasing cost industries. And that's what Marshall gave us. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about supply and demand. This is also what he's very famous for, beyond, like I said, him not thinking there was a marginal revolution. And this actually is consistent with that. So it was, remember, one way of interpreting the so-called marginal revolution was that it was a subjectivist revolution, and that you might say the Menger, Jevons, and Walras, and especially Menger, I would say, overthrew that old classical approach which focused on technicalities, in terms of technical, empirical relationships, physical things, in terms of wealth of material objects, and this new approach of value and price centered everything in the human mind. And so one way of talking about that is to say the new approach emphasized the role of demand, which is subjective utility, in determining price, to the exclusion or to the, let's say, belittlement of supply-side considerations, which were thought to be objective cost. And so Marshall rejected that. Marshall said, no, if you want to explain price, it's demand and supply. And he uses this famous analogy. He said, if you're to say what determines price, is it supply or is it demand? And there were different camps that, stressed one influence versus another. Marshall said, that's silly. That's like if I'm cutting a piece of paper with scissors and saying which blade of the scissors is doing the cutting, the top blade or the bottom blade. And his point was, it's both. And so he thought, again, it was crazy to argue, is it supply or is it demand that ultimately explains price. In terms of their expositions, so this is an area where he was critical of people like Menger, Jevons, and Walras, because he thought, or he argued that, look at what they do in their famous works that ushered in this so-called marginal revolution. They largely take a stock of consumer goods as given, that it's just sitting there, and then they are very carefully analyzing the interaction of that fixed stock of consumer goods with people's subjective preferences and showing, how do equilibrium exchange ratios emerge in a marketplace under those conditions. Whereas the classical economists focused more on long-run production and saying, okay, if this technically is how many labor hours need to go in the production of this commodity, and this technically is how many labor hours need to go in the production of this commodity, and as long as people are buying both in equilibrium, then it has to be the case in the long run that the market prices are in this relationship because it takes, this much more labor to go into this versus the other one. And also they focused on things like capital accumulation. Like, well, if it were profitable to do so, they would start building more machinery. And so now the workers are going to have more tools to work with, and that's going to increase things over time, and then we're going to bring more land under cultivation because of population growth. So Marshall thought that both elements were important. Yes, of course, to finish the discussion, you needed to be able to say at any moment, given a fixed stock of consumer goods that are there, how do we determine the spot price, to use modern terminology, that clears the market that day? But also it's important that, look, it's not that aliens just show up and randomly drop cartons of cigarettes on us. The reason right now this many cartons of cigarettes exist is because in the past, tobacco farmers made decisions and planted certain amounts of tobacco, and people running the factories that produce cartons of cigarettes made certain forecasts and made decisions. And that's why physically these cartons exist right now. So Marshall thought it was very myopic to just focus narrowly on price determination in the context or the setting of a fixed stock of consumer goods, which Menger, Jevons, and Walras tended to do. So remember, it's not that, to take the case of Carl Menger, he understood the importance of production. It's just he didn't get to that yet. He was saying, first, let's make sure we get the ground floor right, and then later I'll move on, and then he never really did, and it was left to his disciples to try to extend the discussion. So, but you can see where Marshall's coming from. He is saying, I am combining what was good from the British classical tradition with their discussion of long-run dynamics or long-run considerations, let's say, to reach equilibration in the long run, and I'm combining the correct analysis of how our market's formed in the moment based on a given stockpile of consumer goods that people like Menger, Jevons, and Walras studied exhaustively. Okay, let me now end this lecture in wrapping up the course, this part one of the History of Economic Thought, because this is the last lecture. Let me wrap up and just give a minority view to sort of give the Austrians their due, because the way I just presented it, and I did it on purpose, I'm trying to let you see where each of these thinkers is coming from. Perhaps I failed in neutrality with Karl Marx, where I didn't really bend over backwards to get you to see his point of view. I sort of showed some of his positions and then gave you criticisms of them. But here I just spent a few minutes talking about Alfred Marshall, and if you say it that way, if you say, how do you determine price? Is it mostly supply-side considerations of objective cost, or is it mostly demand-side considerations of subjective utility? Then you would think, well, surely Alfred Marshall is right. It's both. If you just knew what the demand curve was, you wouldn't know what the market clearing price was. And if you just knew what the supply curve was, you wouldn't know what the market clearing price was. And so doesn't that show the deficiency in both perspectives? If you have people in rival camps who are cheerleading for one versus the other, don't you need to take into account both things? That, yeah, you can know what the demand is, the demand schedules or the preference rankings, but supply considerations certainly affect how many units are ultimately going to exist and therefore where they fall on your value scales. So isn't that important? And by the same token, too, in the other way, I don't care how many labor hours go into the production of a mud pie. If there's no demand for it, the price is going to be zero. And so clearly just merely focusing on supply side, real cost, technical considerations, objective facts of reality and production, that also is not enough by itself to tell you anything about market prices. You need the two to interact with each other. That's Marshall's view, and when I present it like that, it sounds perfectly logical, right? And who the heck could possibly disagree with that? Well, let me explain to you where the Austrians come from, because they think that is misleading. And so I will end with this quick explanation. So people like Wicksteed and then the Austrians proper, meaning like the actual Austrian economists, they pushed back against this. And so, for example, they would say even the supply curve itself, when you draw that, that is not something that is merely built up from technical, empirical, physical considerations. That even the supply element involves subjective value judgments by the producers. So, for example, if we're just talking about a fixed stock of produced goods, then when you're talking about a supply curve for that, you can think of it sort of like as a reservation demand curve, right? So think something like units of bedrooms that are going to be offered on the marketplace. And so right now, this moment, in this particular city, there are only so many bedrooms that physically exist at this second, okay? And then if you want to talk about, okay, what's the price, on Airbnb or whatever for renting out a bedroom for some tenant to come in and spend the night or spend a month or whatever the terms of the contract are, the higher the price, if the supply curve is upward sloping, the more bedrooms that will be offered for rent. But that's not due to some, physical consideration. We're not talking about the production of bedrooms. We're talking about if the price is too low, the owners are going to just keep it for themselves, right? They're going to say, nah, I don't want to sell the use of this bedroom on the marketplace in exchange for money. The price that's being offered is too low. I'm going to reserve it and use it myself, either for storage, like maybe I've got some of my books or something sitting in this bedroom right now, this spare bedroom in my house. And so if the price is only $30 a night, I'm not going to clear that out and let some stranger come into my house for $30 a night. And so I'm using it. Or maybe I just want to keep it vacant in case I have out-of-town guests that want to come in. But if the price goes up to $800 a night, heck yeah, I'm going to clear those books out and tell my guests, tough, they can sleep on the couch because I'm renting out this spare bedroom for $800. And so you can see there that there's not some disparity between the subjective demand side versus objective cost considerations on the supply side. No, even there, if we draw our supply and demand curve to figure out what's the market clearing price for spare bedroom rentals in this region right now in the short run, or let's say in the immediate run, both sides, demand and supply, involve subjective considerations of valuation and who wants to use the thing and how is it allocated based on people's subjective preferences and their willingness to pay for it. Because in a sense, if the bedroom price is only $30 and so somebody says, you know what, I'm not renting it out, you can think of it as if the person himself rented it for $30. It's just he's the owner, so he paid it to himself, right? The opportunity cost is $30. And so the owner might say, I will myself buy this or rent this from myself at $30. Whereas if it gets up to $800, the owner of that bedroom is going to say, whoa, that's too expensive. I don't want to rent this for $800 to store my books in it. I will let someone else rent it for $800. Okay, so you can see that the supply and demand curve there are really just focusing on the subjective preferences and willingness to buy something from different portions of the market, the people who don't currently possess it legally and the people who do possess it legally. And then even if you say, okay, but that seems like you rigged the example, Murphy, isn't that what Alfred Marshall was talking about? If you're talking about a fixed stock of consumer goods or things that could be ultimately used, yeah, then the demand side seems to dominate. But surely once we allow for the fact that the stock itself is variable and dependent upon production decisions, right? So continue with your example, Murphy. I'm still being the critic talking to myself. The supply of bedrooms in a region is not independent of the price. And so if the price is $800 right now, and that's what clears the market, surely that means, absent constraints on building, there's building codes or whatever, but if we had a relatively free market, surely more resources would flow into the construction of more housing, and people would take their den and turn it into another spare bedroom and things like that. So the quantity of bedrooms itself, it depends on the price, and that's the kind of thing people are talking about when they stress the influence of real cost considerations. If it's really easy to build another house and have more bedrooms, then that's going to be one thing. If it's really hard to build more houses and more bedrooms, then that's going to be another thing. And the outcomes are going to be different, even fully taking into account the insights of the demand side marginal revolutionaries. So that is true. But again, even there, when we talk about what's the cost of building more bedrooms, that is not merely something that takes into account objective facts of reality. Value is still, subjective value judgments are still involved there, because ultimately the cost of channeling more wood and glass and worker hours into producing more bedrooms, the real cost of that is ultimately something valuable in the mind, right? It's the opportunity cost. It's the subjective value people place on the next best thing that now can't be produced because we decided to channel more resources into the production of bedrooms. All right, so again, even there, it's not as if you have on one side pure demand sides, subjective mental phenomena, and then on the other side, purely objective things, and the two both contribute. The Austrians stressed the fact that ultimately everything is getting run through a human mind and a person making a subjective value judgment. And that is what guides human action. So ultimately it's human action that gives rise to the observable market phenomena that we as economists are trying to explain. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks everyone for participating in this course. And if you liked this, then I urge you to come back for the second installment, where we're going to get into the economics of the 20th century.